Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Khyam Allami, who is an Iraqi multi-instrumentalist, composer, performer, label manager, and someone who, in my experience, has a very distinct relationship with music. You could say upon 2 different strands. I mean, there's his work as a performer and as someone who interacts with his instruments in real time. I mean, he's an incredibly proficient player of the oud, stringed instrument, and watching him play that, you get this incredible sense that he's thinking about each gesture as he's doing it, every reflex. He's got a real sense of movement to his music and to pauses and silences and gaps and how everything threads together. But also as well, he strikes me as someone who's incredibly reflective of the bigger picture that surrounds his music. He's constantly thinking about his relationship with his instrument, how to revitalize it through technology, and electronic means, or, he recently worked with a hybridized, electric acoustic piano with a microtonal element as well. So there's this sense of theory and critique and reflection that surrounds what he does as well. And I just find him fascinating to talk to. I mean, we've had an interview with Khyam on the site back in 2017 where, he delivered some incredible answers to my questions. And then this is the first time that I've spoken with him verbally. And we had a wonderful conversation. And I really enjoyed the records that he picked as well. I had a week before where I was listening through them and, had my mind blown by some completely fresh experiences. So you can find out more about Khyam's music at khyamallami.com and head over to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for show notes, links to the albums that Khyam picked, and also links to his music. I think that's it. So without further delay, here's my conversation with Khyam Allami on Crucial Listening. Hello, Khyam. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Ciao, Jack. How you doing?
Yeah, all good. Thank you so much for joining me. So before we get to your important albums that you brought today, I wanted to talk about a few of the things that have been going on for you in your musical life recently and your artistic life, because there seems to be quite a lot. I mean, for starters, I know you've just come back from CTM Festival in Berlin and were doing quite a few bits there. I mean, how was that experience going to CTM?
It was awesome. I love this festival. I've played before and I have a good relationship with them. And I was really lucky this time that they afforded me a nice opportunity to premiere this new project and to discuss, all the kind of extra musical things that are around it. So aside from the show that I had at How Eins, which was also with Rabi' Baini and Pouya Pouramin, I did a talk as part of the CTM Festival's discourse program, and I also wrote an article for their festival magazine. So it was really like a holistic vibe and really cool to be there, just to be able to, catch some shows and meet up with some people and enjoy the vibe of Berlin.
Brilliant. And I did read actually that you used a hybrid virtual acoustic piano, like microtonally tuned piano.
Yes.
So yeah, can you tell me about that? That sounds amazing.
Well, basically the new project, the new solo project I'm working on is called Kawalis, and it's a multi-part project. The first two parts are, so the first part is an oud, electroacoustic oud section, which is kind of a work that tries to explore the oud in a very different context, in a bit more of a minimalist and electroacoustic direction, tried to focus on, like magnifying some of its main gestures as an instrument, but also in terms of the gestures of performance, thinking a lot about how to create an atmosphere around, using the world of the maqams and the phrasings, rather than relying on the kind of stereotypical method of taqasim, which is the kind of traditional method for improvising. And then part two is the one that uses the microtonal piano, and that essentially addresses the same issues and the same ideas about the musical system, about the maqam system, about creating a world out of different maqams, but it does it using the piano and yeah, I use a specific model of a hybrid piano made by Kawai, which allows for MIDI output as well. So I'm mixing between a virtual piano and then the acoustic prepared and extended techniques on the piano as well. So it's really it's a strange project because it approaches these two fundamental instruments from the oud in the Arab world is the principal instrument for theory and philosophy and composition, and obviously the same applies for the piano. So it's nice using both, but you're kind of slightly westernizing one and slightly orientalizing one, if you know what I mean, and trying to find a weird grey area in the middle between the two.
And what's it like working with those augmentations of those instruments? I mean, is there a divide between kind of known and unknown elements that you're playing with there in terms of how you navigate it as a player? Like when you're doing a particular gesture, how aware are you of what's going to come out the other side? What kind of sound's going to be produced? Is there a sense of the unknown when you're working with these instruments?
Well, to be honest, they come from that place. Like both parts of this project come from a very intuitive and irrational, illogical place that's really based on desire, and then on a desire to hear this instrument and this kind of music in a very different way. But as that process was developing, obviously things start to kind of solidify, and you start to work with certain tools and then try to create a certain types of form and narrative that can, it's an attempt for it to try and be a bit more captivating for audiences, because I think it's quite an abstract thing. Sometimes I feel very lonely because I feel like I'm trying these things that haven't really been touched upon before. If you think about the oud, electroacoustic oud really hasn't been, there aren't any recordings that you can kind of rely on. It's not like if you're doing electroacoustic harp and you can just go straight to Zena Parkins and revel in her mastery of her instrument and the way she uses things. It's not like, electroacoustic cello or whatever. And the same when you go to the piano, there's like nothing that is, microtonal piano exists, but never in a really modal sense, and never in, especially not when it comes to extended and prepared techniques. So, you never hear maqam being played on a piano, especially not in a very minimalist way. So it's kind of a lonely place. You feel like you're straddling these lines that are a bit vague. And so I try to maintain some sense of narrative so that it doesn't sound that particular for audiences,
Yeah. It sounds potentially like something, as you say, because there's not a precedent there. There's also no sense of what territory's been charted and what remains open for exploration, which at least I guess gives you some kind of guidance as to how your playing may manifest on the instrument. Is it difficult to kind of not get stranded amidst those possibilities, those infinite possibilities that you have as someone working with a particular setup for the first time?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are many possibilities, and there are also many, many ways for it to just be gimmicky and a bit shit, to use for use of a better word. You know, it's whenever you're trying something a bit different, it's always tricky to try and actually get to the heart of it and just keep refining and refining and refining until you get to something that's really poignant and beautiful and expressive, you know, without having gimmicks and you know, ornamentation, I guess is the word. So that's what's been very difficult for me, because it's so easy to just get overexcited and do anything. And I find that, you know, I do hear that kind of approach to a lot of projects in general, and I'm trying to stay away from that. But at the same time, you can't help but, you know, be excited. And sometimes I think those kinds of overexcited mistakes are probably quite, you know, they're kind of necessary, I guess. You just have to do it.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to touch upon was the upcoming premiere you've got of your collaboration with your wife Yalda Yunus, A Universe Not Made for Us. Mm-hmm. So what's it like working with Yalda? I mean, could you tell me a bit about the project, but also about the experience of actually collaborating with her as well?
Yeah. So Yalda and I have been working on this project for about 3 years, on and off, you know, different residencies, and trying to develop the work itself and the kind of language and way of working together. We started by doing a residency that was really completely tabula rasa, let's say. It was, I don't want to say unprepared, but it was planned to be an exploratory encounter where we didn't have any preconditions or preconceptions about what we wanted to do. And during that little process, a lot of kind of intuitive, subconscious ideas made their way to the surface, and we used that as that's when we realized, actually we can actually work together and create something together, because the subconscious collaboration was quite strong. Like, the intuitive language that was being developed was really nice, and we found that we had actually quite a lot in common when it comes to artistic desires. And so one thing, just to kind of give that a bit more context, Yalda is a contemporary flamenco dancer. She's Lebanese, and she studied in Sevilla. She studied with Israel Galvan, who's renowned for being the kind of avant-garde flamenco dancer of his era. And she was really trying to search for a new language within that context that she'd studied and performed so many times in the past. And at the same time, for me, I was searching for something new with the oud and with Arabic music, and with these ideas of, you know, microtonality and tunings and weird gestures and magnifying phrasings and these kinds of things I mentioned about Kawalis. And so very quickly we realized that we're both searching for a similar thing. We both have these kind of traditions at hand and ideas about a contemporary approach and an avant-garde approach, let's say. But at the same time, a desire to create a new way of approaching that avant-gardeness or contemporariness in some shape or form. And that's what the majority of the process was about, trying to find each of our own paths through that, while at the same time trying to support each other. So, and to create an environment that was conducive for these two languages to kind of interact. And the end result is I think a very kind of open and sincere work that tries to just navigate some of these these artistic questions, but also more personal and I want to say political, even though that might be a bit charged, but there is a sense of that in there.
I mean, it's so fascinating to be doing some research in advance of this interview and seeing you manifest your expression in so many different ways. So the other thing I wanted to also mention was your work that you're doing for the PRS Foundation New Music Biennale, which sounds really interesting. What can you tell me about that?
So that's a commission from Opera North in Leeds in England. They contacted me to see if I had any ideas in mind of a project I could do with them within the framework of the New Music Biennial. And I had this had this idea for an installation for a while, which is kind of based on, let's say, a modal maqam-based generative music. This is something that's and microtonal as well. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, but I haven't had time to explore and develop. And this opportunity just seemed perfect to do it. And the team at Opera North, particularly Joe Knuckles, who's in charge of Opera North projects, who are the actual kind of framework that's commissioning me, they got really excited about the idea and have been super supportive. And so, that was proposed to the PRSF, and it was accepted as a commission. So that's what I'm going to be doing, an installation where the music is modal maqam based microtonal generative music.
Wow.
Long-winded.
Well, it brings me on to the final question I wanted to ask you before we go into the albums, which is, when I interviewed you, I think it was a couple of years back, you talked about your relationship with the oud, and I think you likened it to a marriage that was kind of petering out at the time and then was revived by your engagement with different technologies and, Ableton Live and Max. And I'm intrigued because you're doing this project which, centers on, deconstructions of the oud. What's your relationship like with the instrument now, in 2019?
Yeah, good question. Well, it definitely, we managed to revive the spark, me and the oud, and things are going much better. The kind of intimacies come back, and we're discovering new things about each other. So, it really is like a relationship. Right? I guess because I had this desire to I had this need to just explore that instrument in a slightly different way and have a different kind of feedback. And so the use of technology really helped in that. So I've been working a lot with my laptop as a kind of partner, where whatever I input kind of gets regurgitated and spat back at me, and it's not spat back at me. It's a horrible way to talk about relationship. Things get processed in some way and come back out, and so I can react to them and develop a kind of conversation that isn't a monologue. One thing I tire from a lot when it comes to Arabic music is that I feel most of the time it's really, that tradition is really about monologues. It's about one person saying one thing. And unless you're in a very improvised environment where, everybody's really allowed to let go, it's quite difficult to get away from that. Even within the improvised environments, everybody's always kind of working within the traditional framework. And what happens there is that it ends up, rather than feeling like a conversation, it feels a bit like monologue, where everybody's doing their own kind of monologue within a group setting. And that's not really what I've been looking for. And it's quite difficult to find instrumentalists who are that way inclined and also prepared to really try to break down their own playing. And it takes a lot of work. Like you mentioned, the article was from 2 years ago. It's taken me maybe 2 years to be able to get to this kind of interaction with the instrument. So things have changed, and they are better because I made much more of an effort to give the instrument a chance, I guess, and to try and break down, deconstruct my own kind of muscle memory and my own reliance on technique and phrasing and all of this kind of stuff, which all musicians end up kind of falling into. You always fall into a trap of, this is what you know and this is what you can do, and this is what happens when you first pick up the instrument and just let yourself go. And it's quite difficult to challenge that and say, actually today I'm going to say, when you're not allowed to play a single phrase that is within the kind of tradition that you've studied. You have to do something else, and you're not allowed to pluck in X manner, you have to pluck in X manner, or setting these kind of rules and guidelines to try and revive some kind of novelty in your relationship. But it managed to work, and I'm really happy with it now, and it feels good. I don't practice enough, I don't play enough oud. I'm caught up with a million other things, and I just started a PhD in composition as well.
Wow.
So, yeah. It's all kind of it does all kind of go into the same basket it sounds like everything's really spread out, but it all comes from the same place. There is some kind of continuity there, but yeah, the relationship is we're doing much better now. Yeah.
I'm so glad. So let's move to your albums now. I mean, one question that I'd like to ask guests when they come on is how they consider the term important. I mean, was there a particular framing you used or an understanding you used of the word important in order to produce the list of albums you've brought today?
Yeah, I did actually. Important for me meant things that albums that have inspired me to think about things in specific ways, or albums that contain music that permanently resides in my subconscious. You know, there are certain albums that you find yourself singing phrases from when you're doing the dishes or just walking or picking something up. There are things that just hang around, right? Or albums that were important to me now in terms of the way that I'm thinking about music and the kind of developments in my artistic past. So it was really, really hard to pick, you know, as I'm sure it is for every other of your guests in past and future. But that was the kind of criteria. Importance on a kind of personal level, importance on a musical level, and importance in terms of future and the development.
Well, I'll let you pick which order we go in. So if you'd like to give me the name of the first album and a little bit about why it's important to you as well.
So I guess we could take things kind of chronologically. So the first one would be Jamil Bashir's Arabesques. This is a collection of recordings by the Iraqi oud player Jamil Bashir, who is the brother of the very famous Iraqi oud player Munir Bashir. And in my opinion, and in the opinion, I guess, of many oud professionals, Jamil has always been the favorite, the preferred musician, but he never managed to have the same kind of limelight as Munir Bashir. He died quite young, in the late 60s. He actually passed away in London and never kind of got the credence that he deserved, you know. So I wanted to highlight his album, which was really, really important to me when I started playing the oud and when I first discovered it.
And how did you come across it?
Well, this is quite a fun story. So coming across these recordings is quite easy when you first stumble into the world of the oud, because, well, at least it was at the time, because the world of the oud was kind of online, at least, was really relegated to a couple of forums, one called Ziryab and one called Sama'i. And these are like Arab music aficionados, communities of Arab music aficionados who really try to focus on rare recordings and sharing these rare recordings via digital means through these forums. And you very quickly fall upon these recordings by Jamil Bashir. There aren't many recordings that he did, and these are the only official studio recordings of him playing oud solo, as far as I know. Everything else that exists has either been from television broadcasts or from private concerts. And so I stumbled upon these recordings and I started to do a bit of research about where they come from. And when I realized that they were the only official album, I started researching a little bit more. And the story goes that there is an ethnomusicologist by the name of Dr. Jean-Claude Chabrier, who is a kind of a mythical man. And Dr. Chabrier he traveled around the entire Middle East and Central Asia all of his life. And during those travels, particularly in the 60s and 70s, he used to record a lot of musicians. And he did a series of albums called Arabesques, of which Jamil Bashir's is one. There's also one by Munir Bashir, and there's others by I can't remember the musicians' names, but there's an Iranian santur player, there's a Syrian nai player, and a few other things. And these were recordings that he did in professional studios in the Middle East whilst he was traveling, and they were put out by he had a kind of deal, I think, with Pathé or Virgin at the time, and they were put out only on vinyl, and they're completely out of print and unavailable anymore. And so we're all relying on, you know, digitized versions that have been made and put up online on blogs or shared, you know, in these little circles. And I actually, when I discovered the album and discovered this work of Chabrier, I was doing my BA at SOAS in London at the time, and I managed to track him down and go and visit him and have a chat with him in Paris. And he's a really amazing guy who is kind of, on the fringes of everything. He's on the fringes of ethnomusicology because he doesn't agree with the kind of French ethnomusicological dogma, let's say. He's on the fringe of all of the kind of academic and institutional frameworks within which ethnomusicology and musicology and world music and album making function. He's an independent man, and that last time that I saw him would have been probably 2008, 2010. I saw him, and the next day he was about to get into his car and drive to the north of Syria. So literally drive.
What?
Yeah. He's an amazing character. Yeah. He was like, I have got 3,000 euros and my bag full of medicine. He's an old man and very small and quite fragile and has a lot of medical problems. He was like, I've got my bag of medicine and I've got 3,000 euros. I'm going to get in my little car and I'm going to drive to Syria.
Wow.
It's like, you are a legend. Yeah.
Wow. And did you ask him?
Yeah. He has... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, did you ask him about this album and the recording of this record?
Absolutely. So he told me basically that he wanted to... He knew that Jamil Bashir was really like the phenomenal oud player and creative mind out of the two brothers. And also in terms of the music of Iraq. Jamil Bashir apparently had the second biggest and most popular recording studio in Baghdad after the national broadcaster.
Wow.
So he was not only a really incredibly creative and gifted oud player, he was an excellent teacher and also a really forward-thinking artist. He opened his own recording studio in his home with really high quality recording gear. He was inviting musicians from all over the country to come and record and experiment and do things at his studio the whole time. And when Jean-Claude Chabrier approached him to do this recording, he presented the idea of performing the Iraqi maqamat on the oud solo. Now, the Iraqi maqam is a genre all in its own. It's a kind of blend between the Iranian dastgah system and the Arab wasla system. So these are like long form composition, semi-improvised compositional forms, vocal forms mostly. They're all sung, and he decided to perform them on the oud, which is unprecedented. That hadn't been done before him. He's the only one that had done it in such a way. Since then, other musicians have done some. You find, remnants of this Iraqi maqam tradition in people's oud playing, but never in such a concise and poetic way. And so Chabrier was obviously really excited about this because he'd done a lot of musicological research into the Iraqi maqam and the concepts of form and intonation and tuning. And he said to me that there was nobody, softer, gentler, nicer than Jamil Bashir in every way, in his performance, in his language, in his manner, in his hospitality. He was really spoke of him so highly and so kindly, and it just made me fall in love with this guy even more.
And I think you mentioned that it had some kind of effect on your own relationship with the instrument as well. So what did that look like?
Well, the beautiful thing about Jamil Bashir's playing is that it's so poetic and sensitive and really free of any kind of virtuosic muscle flexing. It's much more about the poetry of the language. And actually I did an analysis of one of his performances in comparison with vocal performances of the same Iraqi maqam. And what I realized was that he was literally singing on the instrument. And that's, from a musicological perspective, when you understand that level of detail, it's really, that's really an expression of mastery, because in his mind, he is replicating the way vocalists, singers would approach this tradition, but instrumentally. And the other, the byproduct of that realization is that you come to understand why the oud has such a prominent place in the kind of history of the Arab world. If the oud can so perfectly replicate the voice and vocal ornaments and vocal melodic developments, it's only because the vocal development comes from that whole system being developed on the oud in the first place. And so he kind of, for me at least, made this realization in my mind and helped me tie things round full circle, to know that the oud is the source of the theory and the concept of how this musical tradition is formed. And that's why it's able to actually, mimic a vocalist's performance.
It's such a fascinating circle to embark on. I mean, I think certainly when I've heard of people talk about instruments as being akin to the human voice or reflexes that have the immediacy of the human voice, people tend to go to instruments that you play via the breath. So it's so interesting to hear about an instrument which has that same reflexive relationship, but involves a completely different biological system to achieve the same kind of immediacy. That's so cool.
Yeah. And also the immediacy, the sensitivity, the poetry, the subtlety. We know how powerful singing can be and how the tiniest of little movements can be so effective, and you really hear that in his playing. And I think that's why he's such a master of it. Maybe he doesn't have the same kind of silence, let's say, that Munir Bashir is revered for, but he has far more poetry and far stronger ability of let's call it storytelling or narrative, which I always find really, really endearing, because that's, from an improvisational perspective and from a performance perspective, that is really probably the hardest thing that you have to do. And so far, in terms of the music of the world, we're only ever exposed to that as if within the kind of Indian music, the raga tradition. That's the kind of main tradition that we find this kind of ideas spoken of, and the fact that Jamil Bashir really brings that to life so cohesively in these recordings, for me, was just like magic. Also, considering the fact that each of the recordings on this album are between 3 and 4 minutes, they're all like these very concise, condensed renditions of these Iraqi maqamat, and so you can literally learn what would normally be performed over an hour or 2 hours from a 3-minute extract. And that happens a lot with Indian classical musicians who were recording at the turn of the century, using gramophone discs, and so they had very limited time in order to be able to render ragas, and he is doing exactly the same, even though he didn't have the time restriction.
Wow. It's amazing. I was listening to this over the past couple of days, and listening to you talk about it and explain it makes me consider how I did feel when he was playing, that there's this almost like this tumbling like moment of expression, and then these pauses, and then another moment of expression and pauses. I'm wondering whether is that sort of like akin to singing, where you have the intake of the breath and then another burst, and then a moment of reflection kind of positioned within these flurries of activity. It's it's really
absolutely, and that's his mastery. It's about knowing when to play and knowing when to give your listener a moment to just think about what you said. Here, it's a monologue, of course, because he's a soloist and he's performing, but by providing you with space to consider what he just said, in quotation marks, he gives you the chance to kind of lean in and consider yourself, not only what he's saying. And that's really rare. It's really rare to find that in musicians. I mean, there are obviously a few jazz musicians who are renowned for that. Obviously, Miles Davis being the kind of classic. But this idea of space and giving the listener a moment to just really consider, like you said, what was just said and what idea was just presented is really is a core element of what he does, but also a core element of singing, I guess. Although I would add that there aren't many singers that do that. Even nowadays, people's minds are overactive, and so they just feel like they need to fill the gap all the time. Everybody needs to be doing something all the time. Something has to be happening. It's very difficult to just say something and then wait and let that just resonate and give whoever's listening a moment to ponder and then take them somewhere else. And it's really like storytelling, it's like trying to guide somebody on a journey and to keep a few surprises here and there and keep people's attention captivated. But just a quick note that this technique it actually comes from a very religious Quranic recitation, let's say, aesthetic, where it's very much about the word. So and the text that's being recited, and so it's very much about giving audiences a chance to reflect on this holy text that is being recited. And obviously you can very clearly hear the musicological remnants of that in all Arab music, but specifically in Iraqi maqam, and then even more so in Jamil Bashir's performances, because they're really about that. It's like saying a couple of lines and then waiting a bit and then coming back with another couple of lines and waiting and so on and so forth.
Well, let's go to your second record now, Khyam. If you'd like to give me the name of it and then also a bit about why it's important to you as well.
Sure. So the second one is Dastan by Muhammad Reza Shajarian and Parviz Meshkatian. This is an Iranian music album. Muhammad Reza Shajarian is the vocalist, and Parviz Meshkatian is the sound tour player and composer. This is one of Shajarian's least known works. I discovered it when I was in Iran back in 2010. I went there for a couple of weeks just to hang out, meet musicians, and get to know that musical world. And I met a really wonderful tar and setar player by the name of Navid, who barely spoke any English and agreed to take me out record shopping. And this is one of he made me buy 50 records, I think.
Wow.
I came back with a massive suitcase of CDs and books and tapes and stuff. And this was one of the albums he made me buy at the time. And when I got home and listened to it, I was just totally blown away. So the Iranian music system is based on the concept of a thing called the Dastgah, which is similar to the maqam system. So we're talking about a kind of mode, but it's not just a mode. It's a series of micro melodic phrases from which the performer or composer takes the influence and creates new works. There's also a particular form in terms of how the melodic modulations develop and how the music is approached. So some parts are solo vocals, sometimes are vocals accompanied by an instrumental interjections, sometimes there's fast-paced kind of dances, sometimes there's very open musical introductions or interludes. And so these forms and micro-melodic formula, they give the composer and performer a kind of guideline about how to develop things. And at the time when I was discovering this, I was just studying this musical tradition, and this particular record, Dastan, is in a Dastgah called Čahārgāh. And this very, very quickly became one of my favorite modes in the entire world. It has a very particular intonation and tuning. It has a phenomenal character, and its development is like 3 parts. It goes into a very sweet kind of minor mode at one point, and then it goes into a very gnarly microtonal mode at another point, and then it comes back round at the end. And I find it so fascinating how, you know, changing the tuning of one note can just open up an entire world, and I think this album is a fantastic example of how that musical system works. Aside from that, the instrumental interludes at the beginning of the album and at the end of the album, just before the last song, are absolutely phenomenal. They're really forward thinking. They approach the music in a very different way, and they approach the tradition in a very different way, even though today maybe it sounds a little bit dated. But it just hangs with you. There's an energy about those musical phrases and that tuning that just resonates and hangs. And this is the album that I just kind of carry in my subconscious all the time. I just find myself, I don't know, washing up or tidying up my room and singing phrases from those melodies. They're just stunning.
Wow. I mean, I love those records that have this peripheral presence that just linger with you regardless of whether or not you choose to listen to them. I mean, is your compulsion then at that point to go back and listen to the record, or is it simply enough to have it within your life and your subconscious in a kind of imagined form?
Yeah, it starts when at the beginning you're like just addicted and you just want to keep going back to it and listening to it. But after a while, it's when it becomes so embodied, right, embedded inside you. I don't feel the need to listen to it. I actually quite the opposite. I feel the need to just sit, do nothing, and hear it in my mind. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about music, is you can just sit and in silence and relive, you know, music that you've heard before, and it doesn't matter whether you understand music or whether you're doing it correctly or not. You know, you just sit back and you hear that song and it makes you feel a certain way. It's just magic. I've never been able to do the same with cinema, for example, or an art piece or anything else. I can only do it with music, and it just means the world to me, that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as well, that sense of yearning and not having, I think, is probably something which is more difficult to instigate nowadays, because it's so easy to follow that compulsion to Spotify and just play it. So
exactly,
yeah, it's something you have to consciously
it ruins the mystery,
right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm a huge David Lynch fan, and so sometimes I really think about the feeling in certain scenes that he has in his work, and he always talks about this. He talks about this idea of creating a world, right, in which there's a certain energy, there's a certain vibe. And you can really feel that in his work, and sometimes I like to just think about the Red Room while, you know, that track is playing, and you just put yourself in that place. It's really beautiful. It's a really beautiful sensation, and it's a shame that that mystery in today's age is very often kind of discarded in favor of immediacy, right? It's a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it divorces the material from the ability to haunt you, which often is about absence as much as actually experiencing it.
Exactly. There's a few other records that I feel that way about. They're very different. You know, one of them is Anima by Tool. One is Live at Leeds by The Who. they're completely different vibes. But yeah, that's what my Spotify radio, you know, internal Spotify radio is like. It would jump from, you know, Muhammad Reza Shajarian to Maynard James Keenan, you know, and it makes perfect sense.
And you mentioned actually studying the musical modes that are utilised within, Muhammad's music for one. When you increase your understanding of the structures that underpin this music, I mean, do you find that satisfying, that opens up avenues of understanding this music and relating with it in a different way?
Yeah. I mean, I get asked this question a lot because I do a lot of research, and I'm always kind of curious to understand things. People always say, "Oh, but doesn't it kind of remove some of the mystery? And now you know what's coming, now you know what's happening." And I don't think it does. It allows you to appreciate things more, because when you're dealing with artists who are really masters of their craft, it's great to have your initial emotional and intuitive reaction, and I think that's like the spark that you really have to hold on to. But I also really love the long burning embers that come after that. So you have that spark, and then this massive bonfire that happens when you discover something, and then as you delve deeper, you allow that warmth, right, of that fire to maintain for so much longer, and it stops being a fireworks show, and it becomes a long burning, thing that helps you keep you warm for a really long period of time. And I think that's what, getting into studying things and understanding them helps you appreciate. It's very difficult to maintain a sense of distance, to be able to actually hear new things after that with the same kind of openness and lack of judgment. So I think that's where it gets tricky. It doesn't get tricky when it comes to the particular piece in question. And I love it. Like, the more I know that, very soon he's going to go up to that high note and he's going to stay up there for a while because that's the X section that's coming up now. It's like, it's almost orgasmic because you know what's coming, and then it comes and it's fucking awesome, and then you get this payoff afterwards, and you're just like, it's like hearing your favorite tune and knowing that the chorus is coming up.
Yeah,
it's the same thing, but stretch over like 2 hours.
I mean, his voice is incredible. I watched a video actually of him doing a Tiny Desk concert, one of the NPR ones.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's like 5 years ago as well. I think he was in his 70s by this point, and just there's a point actually where I was watching where he takes like a very deliberate in-breath and then catapults up like an octave above where he was effortlessly. It's amazing. It's so good. No, he's phenomenal, and if you're really into him, if this kind of captured your imagination, I would really recommend listening to as much of his work as possible. But if you really want to dig deep, he's got some recordings where he recites the Quran, and I know religious music is always a bit taboo, but when you listen to that stuff and where he's given the complete free reign of time, because he needs to, like we were talking earlier, get that meaning across, and so time, he's not on a radio station, or he's not recording an album and confined by things. He's free to take his time and let you engage with his rendition. It's just magic, man. Really magic. Wow. Oh, Khyam, I think I'm going to have to, if you could send me some links after this for me to check out, that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
So let's go to your final album now. So if you could give me the name of it and a little bit about why it's important to you as well.
Sure. So the last one is Wendy Carlos's Beauty in the Beast. Again, this is a really unknown record. It's out of print. You'll only find it by digging around on online communities, and it's an album that she made in the late 80s that utilizes only microtonal tunings. So Wendy Carlos is very famous for Switched on Bach and the use of her music in Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. She was the one who kind of brought synthesizers to the masses and made electronic music seem acceptable by people because she performed Bach on it. But she was also a real visionary who was really interested in the development of music and technology together, and in pushing the boundaries of what technology could do. And for this particular record, she was really focused on non-Western tunings, her own devised tunings, and historical Western tunings. And in order to do those with electronic instruments at the time, she had to hire software programmers to create computer software that would allow her to make these tunings accessible and to be able to compose works in these tunings. And this album is just an incredible feat of ingenuity, compositional creativity, and technological boundary pushing for the time. Nobody else was doing something like this. You had Harry Partch in the late 70s, even earlier than that. Harry Partch was creating his own acoustic instruments to render some of his ideas about tunings and intonation, but Wendy Carlos took that, much more, much further, and used synthesizers and computer-generated sound to make this work, and it's mind-blowing. It's very strange, and it takes a bit of getting used to, because it sounds weird and the tunings are weird, and she uses some tunings that are really obscure that she created, but there are moments of really consonant, blissful music that's just really out there at the same time. I really love the track, I can't remember what it's called, A Poem for Bali, I think it's called, where she basically creates a new work for gamelan, for Javanese gamelan, but completely synthesized. I mean, that whole track is created using a digital computer and probably a mix of digital and analog synthesizers, and so just that on its own, that 12 minutes is enough to totally blow my mind, because that means that she had to not only study the tunings and know how to navigate those tunings, but she also had to study how gamelan music is composed, and then to compose a new work based on those. It's just mind-blowing that she did that alongside everything else that's on that record. It's just really out of this world.
And then funnel also that understanding into mathematics effectively in order to realize it in a musical form. It's just unbelievable. I mean, do you remember how you first came across this record?
I only came across it in the last 6 months, because I've been doing, as soon as I started my PhD, one of the first things I started looking at was the use of microtonality in contemporary composition. And I had heard about Wendy Carlos's experiments, and I'd known that she'd created a few tunings. She has a couple of articles on her website, but I also had heard about an article that she had written for the Computer Music Journal in the 80s, discussing her process about this particular record. So as soon as I started my PhD, I managed to track down a copy of this article and have a read, and it blew my mind, because she was so unacademic in her language, but extremely academic in the rigorousness of her research. And when you understand the lengths that she had to go to actually make this album a reality, and the kind of knowledge that underpins this process, it just makes you love her even more. And when I discovered it, it totally blew me away, because she's not only trying to grasp non-Western compositional techniques, but she's also going way beyond that. She's doing multiple different traditions. She's using multiple tunings in the same compositions. She's pushing all of her equipment to the limit of what it can do, whilst also having a completely masterful grasp of the mathematical and scientific background that underpins all of this stuff, which is so rare in the world, right? So she's really an inspiration, and when I heard it, I was just blown away. So this is new for me, and this is what I mentioned earlier about the three different categories I tried to choose albums in. So this is an album that's really inspiring me in terms of now and what I'd like to think about for the future. That's not to say that I want to create an album that sounds like Beauty and the Beast, but I'm really working a lot on the idea of using technology and microtonality to create new works that look at the Arab maqam system and Middle Eastern musical systems in a different way, and in a sense that's what my PhD is about too.
And I read those articles that you mentioned where she talks about the creation of this record, and also the liner notes, which are really insightful into each track. But she talks a lot in terms of discovery and exploration, but she uses a lot of metaphors around just being in these sprawling, gigantic planes of possibility, which immediately from the outside seem to parallel with the experience that potentially you yourself are going through with combining these technologies with your own instrumental setup. I mean, did you feel any, or do you feel any affinity with her experience of entering new terrain and then being like, right, okay, how am I going to do this?
100%. 100%. And the beauty of Wendy is that she wasn't afraid to share the experiment. And by that, I mean, I think she knew perfectly well that some of these compositions, some of these ideas maybe weren't like 100%, whatever, like artistically wow, but for her it was an experiment. She's asking questions and she's letting the answers just be, and she's letting the answers exist. And I think this was the main kind of influential point that I took from this record, was don't be afraid to ask questions and let whatever creative outcome just be. You don't have to form the creative outcome into this masterful work that is so perfectly balanced in every shape and form, You can just let it be. You can just express and share your perspective on this, wide open plane, like she mentions. We're all gonna come into that space from a different angle, from a different perspective, from a different height, from a different color, right? So it's important to just let that be. And I think a lot about her, and I think a lot about artists like Paul Klee, for example. Paul Klee's oeuvre is basically his experiments. The majority of his really great works that are really touching are the ones where he was just trying something out. And I think you can even say the same for like Jeff Buckley's recordings from the Cine Cafe, or PJ Harvey's 4-track recordings, or this kind of stuff. Those moments in artists' careers where they're just being really open to the creative process and letting things be and not trying to control them too much. And that's something that I struggle with, because I feel like in today's age there's such an incredible back catalogue of masterworks that we're kind of... They're the shoulders of the giants that we're standing upon, and sometimes it feels really intimidating to try and create something that might be as good as the things that mean the most to you. And this record and this kind of idea has been really empowering. You don't have to create something amazing, just do it and let it be. And the fact that you're asking these kind of questions should be enough.
Well, Khyam, thank you so much. This has been so great to speak to you about these albums and also your latest projects as well. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks to you, Jack, for asking. It's nice to share these little gems with people. So,
and if people want to keep up to date with what you're doing and the projects that you've got coming up, where's the best place for them to head online?
Twitter and my website. I'm really recoiling from Facebook and Instagram and all these other social network stuff, because they're starting to drive me crazy. So Twitter is a good place for regular things, but the mailing list on the website is the place for the main updates.
Fantastic. Well, great. That's all for this week. So to everyone listening, I will see you next time.